The Battle of Friedland took place on June 14, 1807, during the French invasion of Russia. It was one of Napoleon's greatest victories, but also his last major battle, as his campaign would soon after end in disaster. In this episode of the History Hub, we are going to look at some of the things that we learned this week and what they tell us about the campaign as a whole. Before we do so, though, remember to support the channel and hit that subscribe button. The first thing that I want to highlight is just how big the armies involved were in this battle. Napoleon commanded an army of around 80,000 men, while the Russians had around 40,000 troops. This makes it the second biggest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, only beaten by the Battle of Borodino, which took place just 2 months later. While such large numbers may sound impressive, there is really nothing special about them, as the rules of war at the time meant that armies of this size were pretty standard. What is more interesting is the breakdown of the two armies. Napoleon's Grande Armée was made up of 40,000 French troops, 20,000 Poles, and 20,000 troops from other German states like Bavaria. The Russian army was made up of 26,000 Russian soldiers, with another 3,000 Cossacks, and 11,000 of various nationalities, including Germans, Latvians, and Lithuanians. What this means is that neither of these armies were purely Russian or French. Both sides had allies. And as the fight for dominance in Europe continued, these multinational coalitions would become even more important. While the total strength of the armies is impressive, it should be noted that neither side was at full strength here. Both sides had suffered heavy losses in previous battles and were taking time to recover. For example, the Russian army had suffered heavy losses during their retreat from the French in the first half of 1807, and in the weeks before the battle, both sides had been engaged in minor actions while trying to find each other. These actions had taken their toll. One of the most interesting elements of the battle was how close it was to being a massacre. At one point in the fighting, the French nearly surrounded a Russian corps and could have destroyed it. This would have led to a decisive victory for Napoleon. However, poor coordination meant that they did not take advantage of the situation, and the Russians were able to escape and regroup. Another interesting element is how the outcome of the battle hung in the balance for so long. There was no decisive moment in the battle where one side got the upper hand. Instead, the fighting was extremely close throughout, and the French only won because they had more reserves available than the Russians. This is highlighted by the casualties. All of these factors combined to create a confusing mess of a battle. So let's look at some of the tactics employed by the two sides. As always, the French had the best artillery in the world, and used it to great effect during the battle. They bombarded the Russian forces, inflicting heavy casualties. This is one of the reasons why the Russians ultimately lost the battle. Their lines were weakened by artillery fire, and eventually broke. However, this was not the only reason why the Russians lost. One of the main reasons was their leadership. The Russian commander, Barclay de Tolly, made several mistakes during the battle. He was too cautious in the early stages and did not press home his attacks when he had the chance. He also failed to appreciate the strength of the French artillery and did not take steps to counter it. Finally, he made a critical mistake when he ordered his troops to retreat. He did not have a proper plan of retreat, and his troops ended up in a disorganized rout. It wasn't all bad news for the Russians, though, as many of their generals fought well during the battle. Generals Kutuzov, who would later go on to defeat Napoleon in the Battle of Borodino, and Essen fought bravely and effectively during the Battle of Friedland. However, their good performance was not enough to secure a Russian victory. One of the most surprising aspects of the battle was the performance of the Polish troops. Many people forget that Poland had been wiped off the map by the three partitions of Poland between Prussia, Austria, and Russia in the late 18th century. But Napoleon promised to restore Poland if they helped him in his war against the Russians. In return, the Poles formed a corps of 20,000 troops and joined the French. They fought alongside the French in the Battle of Friedland and performed brilliantly. They were the key to the French victory, and Napoleon was very grateful for their help. He awarded them with many honors, and they became a key part of his empire. The Battle of Friedenau was a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars. It led to the end of the Third Coalition against Napoleon, and he was able to consolidate his power in Europe. However, it was also the last major battle that Napoleon would win. His invasion of Russia would soon after end in disaster. Part of this was due to the sheer size of Russia. The country was huge, and the French were not able to fully conquer it. Part of this was also due to the scorched earth tactics employed by the Russians. The French were not able to get enough supplies, and this led to the collapse of the Grande Armée. Finally, the extreme cold of the Russian winter also played a role. The French were not prepared for the cold, and this led to even more problems with supplies and morale. All of these factors combined to create the perfect storm that led to the destruction of the Grande Armée. Despite this, Napoleon would go on to fight for many years after Friedland. He would eventually be defeated and exiled to the island of St. Helena, where he would die in 1821. The Battle of Friedland is an important part of his story, and it is an often overlooked battle of the Napoleonic Wars. There are a few lessons that we can take from this battle. The first lesson is that size does matter. The larger army usually has the advantage in battle. This was certainly the case in Friedland. The French were able to wear down the Russians and eventually win the battle because they had more troops. The second lesson is that experience matters. The French were more experienced than the Russians, and this gave them an edge. They knew how to fight, and they were able to use their skills to outmaneuver the Russians. The third lesson is that logistics are important. The French were better supplied than the Russians, and this helped them to win the battle. So what surprised me about this battle? Well, I was surprised by the number of casualties. I knew that the battle was costly in terms of lives, but I didn't realize just how costly it was. Over 25,000 men were killed or wounded during the battle, and this is one of the highest casualty counts for any battle during the Napoleonic Wars. I was also surprised by the performance of the Polish troops. I knew that the Poles fought well, but I didn't realize just how important they were to the French victory. Overall, the Battle of Friedland was a decisive victory for Napoleon, and it helped him to consolidate his power in Europe. It was also a costly victory, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Grande Armée. If you enjoyed this video, then please remember to support the channel. Thanks for watching.